buongiorno a tutte e a tutti, sono Massimo Leone, il direttore del Centro per gli Studi Religiosi della Fondazione Bruno Kessler. Oggi abbiamo il piacere di continuare la nostra riflessione sul tema seminariale di quest'anno, che è quello molto vasto della trasformazione, della conservazione nella religione e nell'etica, con un intervento invece molto puntuale intitolato Ripensare le collettività religiose, intenzionalità collettiva nello studio della religione, grazie alla partecipazione di un ospite di spicco, il professor Andrea Rota, professore presso l'Università di Oslo, dove insegna Religious Studies nel Dipartimento di Cultura, Religione, Asia e Studi Medio Orientali, così è stato tradotto in italiano, ma insomma si tratta dell'ICOS, che è un dipartimento molto noto dell'Università di Oslo, ove è attualmente coordinatore del centro di ricerca con una particolare enfasi su Religion and Politics. Ricordo alcune sue pubblicazioni recenti presso case editrici di prestigio. Nel 2023 Collective Intentionality and the Study of Religion, Social Ontology and Empirical Research, pubblicato da Bloomsbury Academic, e poi la curatela di un volume sempre del 2023, questa volta per Brill, Religion and Academia Reframed, Connecting Religion, Science and Society in the Long 60s. Gli do dunque il benvenuto, lo ringrazio ancora una volta e gli lascio la parola per questo intervento.
Molte grazie, buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. Permettetemi per cominciare di vedere se la condivisione dello schermo funziona anche la seconda volta. Ditemi se vedete la presentazione, io non vedo più voi.
Vede perfettamente.
Benissimo. Molte grazie, dottor Leone, per la cortese presentazione, molte grazie a Boris Reme per l'invito. La presentazione sarà in inglese, così è stato discusso e deciso. I saluti penso possano essere in italiano. Mi spiace di non poter essere presente di persona a Trento, sono stato presso la Fondazione Bruno Kessler nel 2018 ed è stata un'esperienza molto molto positiva. Questa volta dovremo accontentarci di un incontro online. Benissimo, passo all'inglese, comincio con la presentazione. So, as you can see, the title of my talk is rather pompous, Rethinking Religious Collectivities, but its goal is more modest and can be divided in two parts. My first aim is to introduce the concept of collective intentionality, primarily developed within the tradition of analytical philosophy, into the study of religion. In essence, collective intentionality is the form of intentionality that distinguishes how minds can be jointly oriented towards something or can be jointly be about something. So it distinguishes the situation in which I want to eat an ice cream and you want to eat an ice cream and we eventually meet at the ice cream truck, and the situation in which we want to eat an ice cream together. My main thesis is that when two or more people collectively intend something, they form a special kind of social group, one that displays interesting properties. The philosophical challenge then is to arrive at an adequate description of collective intentionality, of how it arises and what follows from it. My second aim is to explore the usefulness of collective intentionality for the analysis of empirical data. These aims reflect my understanding of the study of religion as a distinct academic discipline that is both historical and systematic. Historical in the sense that this does not confine itself to speculative reflection, but engages with the complex realities of the world. And systematic in the sense that it seeks to move beyond the collection of facts and case studies to formulate general, if not universal, theoretical standpoints. This in turn poses the challenges of constructing a methodological bridge between philosophical imagination and real-world data. Most of the ideas that I will present today are developed in my book Collective Intentionality and the Study of Religion, published by Bloomsbury in 2023. The book is available free of charge as an open access publication. And I mention this not only because one should never miss an opportunity for shameless self-promotion, but also because by now the book knows more than I do. It presents my idea with a degree of precision and structure that I will not be able to replicate in this talk. That said, I would like to take this opportunity to reflect on some of the questions that readers of the book have raised and how my thinking around the topic of collective intentionality has evolved, becoming in some respect more radical. I'm especially looking forward to developing this idea in our discussion after the talk, and I hope to rise to the challenge of your thoughtful and provocative questions and remarks. I would like to start my talk by pointing to the research gap that my book hopes to fill, namely how to conceptualize religious collectivities in the study of religion. From there, I will move on to the notion of collective intentionality and spend some time to explain this concept. Of course, my presentation will be limited to a few key aspects, and I will steer clear of technicalities. Nevertheless, it's important to note that collective intentionality comes in many flavors, and I would like to pause briefly to explain the criteria that shape my choice among different philosophical options. In the end, in the third part of my talk, I will argue that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. What I mean is that a new concept is only useful in the study of religion if it actually helps to make sense of something concrete. To show that this is the case with collective intentionality, I will present two examples from my own research among Jehovah's Witnesses in Switzerland and Germany. After this more hands-on part, I will return to the theoretical level to address a few critical questions about my framework, and finally, I wrap things up by sketching some new and possible direction for empirical research that I hope to discuss with you during the Q&A part of this talk. So without further ado, let me turn to my first point, the issue of religious collectivities. When identifying a research gap, one is almost forced to caricature the state of a given field, at least to some extent. Still, I think it's fair to say that the sociology of religion of the second half of the 20th century has largely been the sociology of the religious individual. As a result, theoretical reflection on collective forms of religion, those rooted in the personal pronoun we rather than I, has not been adequately pursued. To be sure, for the classical thinkers of the discipline, the collective dimension of religion and the condition of its possibility was of central importance. Yet the idea of community has been framed often in rather romantic terms as something under threat in the modern world, and its fate has been closely tied to that of religion itself, both seemingly in decline in an increasingly secular age. Thomas Luckmann, here picture, and his book of 1967, The Invisible Religion, probably did more than any other author to popularize the idea of the privatization of religion. It marked a theoretical shift in the study of contemporary religion, placing individual trajectories at the center of attention and paving the way for the study of various forms of spirituality. This shift toward the individual is visible not only in the choice of research topics, but also in the way theoretical reflection has been framed. This is particularly evident in the success of rational choice approaches to the study of religion in the 80s and 90s. These approaches take the ideal of the individual homo economicus as its starting point. And to be sure, rational choice theories are interested in collective phenomena, such as religious revivals or the formation of cults, but they tend to reduce this to a sum of individual rational decisions and their aggregate effects. Since the turn of the millennium, there has been a renewed interest in religious collectivities within the study of religions. Communities are often portrayed as safe havens in the liquid world of late modernity. Yet the individual still tends to remain the implicit starting and ending point. For instance, studies in so-called post-traditional communities emphasize the formation of fleeting groups of like-minded individuals who come together, often anonymously, for a brief period of intense shared emotional experience, and then part ways without forming lasting relationships. This is not to say that collectivist approaches to religion, approaches not rooted in the individual, have entirely disappeared. One prominent example is Robert Bella's work on civil religion and his critique of Charles Taylor's concept of a post-Durkheimian society, a society in which radical individualism no longer relates to a social form. For Bella, such a concept neglects the fact that even individual forms of religion are shaped by social reality. In line with a Durkheimian perspective, he insists that society is the prerequisite and not the outcome of individual attitudes and actions, including of individualist one. However, as we will see, such a position potentially entails a certain metaphysical cost. So how then does the concept of collective intentionality fit into this broader picture? I argue that collective intentionality offers a way to conceptualize religious collectivities that avoids both the Scylla of individualism and the Charybdis of sociological holism. Individualist approaches hold that human collectives can be conceptually reduced to the attitudes, actions, and interaction of their constitutive members. Max Weber, here playing the role of Scylla, viewed everyday attributions of intentionality to entities such as families, sport teams, or congregations as convenient metaphorical shortcuts. Yet, he famously argued that, for sociological purposes, there is no such thing as a collective personality which acts. In its more radical form, one that Max Weber did not necessarily share, individualist positions hold that an intentional state, such a belief, a goal, an emotion, can be attributed to a group only if all or most of its members individually hold that same state. To say, for example, that a congregation believes in miracles would simply mean that most of its members personally believe in miracles. A collective intentionality approach explicitly rejects this aggregative or summative understanding of collectivity. To see why, consider a number of commuters stuck in traffic, each privately convinced that the situation is the new mayor's fault. Even though this belief is shared by every member in this set of individuals, there is clearly nothing collective happening here. And even if each of them were to shout out of the car window, "I believe this is the new mayor's fault," we still would not have a collective belief, but rather a collection of personal beliefs. The situation may be different if they were to shout in unison, "We believe this is the new mayor's fault." But explaining why this is different is trickier than it first appears. One needs to account for how people move from a set of I's to a we that means more than each and every one of us. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before addressing this issue, we need to consider the opposite option. That is, the Charybdis associated with a caricature of Durkheim, which suggests that in order to attribute an intentional state to a group, we must postulate a collective entity capable of carrying that intention. On this view, human collectivities are sui generis entities, ontologically irreducible to the sum of their members. However, the idea of a metaphysical distinct actor somehow floating over and above the individual is difficult to sustain and has been rejected by most philosophers working on collective intentionality. It is incidentally worth noting that the philosopher credited with the introduction of the term collective intentionality, Wilfrid Sellars, was inspired by Durkheim's concept of homo duplex, mediated through the work of Célestine Bouglé, whose writings Sellars' father translated into English. Sellars was intrigued by the intelligibility of statements that highlight a tension between binding collective attitudes and individual intentions, such as, "We disapprove of women smoking, but I don't." However, being committed to an empiricist philosophy of mind, he could not appeal to the notion of a group mind capable of holding beliefs or intentions. In summary, most contemporary philosophers working on collective intentionality adopt an ontologically reductivist position. Collective actors are not a kind of res cogitans distinct from the res extensa of their members. Rather, they are defined by the distinctive way in which the potential members of a group view themselves in relation to one another. The main point of disagreement, then, concerns how to conceptualize this distinctive perspective and what theoretical resources are required to capture it adequately. Looking at the four most prominent philosophers in the field, Michael Brachtman, John Searle, Raimo Tuomela, and Margaret Gilbert, we can see that three of them consider that the language of individual intentionality is insufficient for this task. That is, in their view, it is not possible to describe collective intentions solely in terms of first-person intentions and their interrelation. For example, I believe that you believed and I believe that you believe. Instead, they argue that collective intentions require participants to refer to an irreducible and ineliminable concept of a group, a we. In the book, I side with them, but from this point onward, the discussion becomes highly technical. And attempt to summarizing it here would be not only very difficult, but probably quite tedious. So instead of doing so and comparing each and every standpoint to highlight strength and weakness, I would like to point out some of the core criteria that I used for my assessment. And these criteria were not only strictly philosophical. My main concern was to identify which approaches were most suitable for practical application. So in other words, if collective intentionality is to serve as a philosophical foundation for the social scientific study of religion and of religious collectivities, then its conceptualization must be not only philosophically sound, but also usable and useful when applying it to empirical research settings. Against this backdrop, the approaches developed by Tuomela and Gilbert appear particularly well suited, as they fulfill a number of bridging criteria between philosophical speculation and practical application. Despite their differences, both authors frame collective intentionality as epistemically public. That is, as a reality that is in principle accessible to a third-person observer. This would not be the case if collective intentions were conceived merely as private states of the mind. Second, they offer a distinctive constitutive criteria for the formation of collective intentions. That is, they outlined the conditions and processes necessary for a collective intention to come about. These criteria are, in general, communicative mechanisms that are amenable to external observation. And finally, they identify distinctive consequences of collective intentionality, specific way in which the world is altered by collective intentions. In particular, they argue that collective intentions are accompanied by a particular kind of normativity, one that provides extrinsic reasons for actions and allow for specific form of rebuke and accountability. Again, I would like to avoid getting into technicalities for each approach, but fortunately, both authors offer effective intuition pumps in the form of vignettes that help us grasp key aspects of their accounts without requiring a deep dive into the underlying philosophical machinery. Although these vignettes might seem trivial, even silly, they encapsulate important philosophical insights and will prove useful later in the discussion of the empirical examples. Gilbert, for example, invites us to imagine a group of people gathered in a room, each reading the same poem. At this point, nothing beyond physical co-presence characterizes them as a group in any meaningful sense. And analogously to the commuter's example, the situation would not change significantly even if the readers were to discover that each and every one of them likes the poem they are reading. Now, in a different scenario, the same people gather to discuss the poem. After reading it aloud, they exchange views and come to the conclusion that the poem is very moving. At that point, a new person enters the room and asks about the poem. If one of the participants were to say, "It's very dull," we can imagine the other reacting with surprise, saying something like, "But we thought it was very moving." What has changed between the two situations is that in the second case, the readers, through communicative practices, have agreed to let a certain interpretation stand as an attitude that can be described of the group as a whole. They are now jointly committed to a particular collective belief about the poem, and on that basis, they feel entitled to rebuke the other person who openly contradicts the group's view. Note that in this case, how the individual's personal feel about the poem is irrelevant. Even if most readers were to revise their personal belief, privately concluding that the poem is indeed dull, the collective view would still stand, along with the collective commitment to uphold it. An individual is not in a position to revise the group stance unilaterally. Only the group as a whole can do so. Interestingly, we find here the same tension between collective norms and individual attitudes that originally intrigued Sellars. Tuomela offers a different but compatible picture of the generation and consequences of collective intentionality. He does so through the image of a bulletin board that states a collective goal. For example, we will organize a picnic on the mountaintop. People are invited to sign their names on the board and indicate what they will contribute. I will bring the wine, or I will bring the meat pie. The bulletin board provides public accessible information about who is contributing to the collective goal and give each participant a normative reason to expect that the others will fulfill their part. If you and I have signed up for the mountaintop picnic, and upon reaching the top, I see that you have not brought your share of the food, I can rebuke you in the name of the group for failing to bring about our shared activity. But the obligation runs both ways. The collective commitment also gives me a reason to help you carry your backpack if you're struggling, because we cannot reach our collective goal unless you also make it to the mountaintop. Note that I might not feel like carrying your backpack. However, the collective intentions provide desire-independent reasons for action. That is, reasons that do not depend on personal inclinations or preferences, but arise from the shared commitment to a collective goal. Now, do these seemingly silly stories about poems and mountaintop picnics have any bearings on the life of real people? And do they actually help us understand what constitutes a religious collectivity? To begin answering this question, I would like to turn to the Jehovah's Witnesses as a case study. I will draw on fieldwork that I conducted among them a few years ago. Unfortunately, I do not have time to delve into the history of the Watchtower Society, but I trust that your everyday knowledge of this group will be sufficient to allow for to follow the key points of my empirical case study. Let me emphasize that I do not consider Jehovah's Witnesses a special case in any sense. Rather, they serve exempli gratia as a case that highlights broader dynamics concerning the role of collective intentionality in religious settings. Collective intentions, I argue, are what constitutes Jehovah's Witnesses as a religious collectivity, distinct from a mere group of people who happen to be Jehovah's Witnesses. We can start by examining the activity for which Jehovah's Witnesses are perhaps most widely known, their door-to-door ministry. In conversation with active members, it quickly becomes clear that preaching is not merely an accessory religious practice, but an integral part of their lifestyle, one to which they devote a significant amount of time, often organizing their secular activities around their ministry schedule. In many cases, they express a strong sense of urgency about the message they are bringing and underscore its importance. However, if one digs a little deeper, it becomes apparent that their attitude toward the ministry is not one of unqualified enthusiasm. Their stories are punctuated by feelings of disappointment when doors are slammed in their faces, and by unease at the prospect of knocking at the doors of strangers. As one of my interlocutors puts it, it's not human nature to go around ringing doorbells. Another witness echoed this sentiment. Overall, I do not consider it a burden, he says, before adding, but should it be that we don't have to do it anymore, I could live with that. So how can we make sense of the Jehovah's Witnesses' commitment to an activity that many view as important but not particularly enjoyable? Rational choice theorists have addressed this and similar cases by emphasizing individual cost-benefit reasoning. According to their framework, members are motivated by the prospect of maximizing return on their participation in group life. Practices that require substantial investment, whether in time, effort, or exposure to social stigma, help deter free riders, thus reinforcing group cohesion and enhancing the quality of collective goods such as participation in worship services. From this perspective, what constitutes the Jehovah's Witnesses as a collectivity is the outcome of individuals strategically pursuing personal gains through religious engagement. An approach based on collective intentionality offers a different picture. But to sketch this alternative, it's first necessary to consider an aspect of the Jehovah's Witnesses' life that is often overlooked in academic literature: their bi-weekly congregational meetings. One possible reason for this oversight is that these meetings are, quite frankly, rather tedious. They are largely devoted to the reading and discussion of Watchtower Society publications, and as a prominent sociologist once observed, they feel more like seminars than conventional religious services. Yet, focusing solely on their educational function risks missing the performative dimension of these meetings. A closer look reveals that doctrinal content is only one of the topics addressed at this meeting. At least as much time, if not more, is devoted to discussing and preparing members for their ministry, particularly to the distribution of the Watchtower and Awake magazines. In these and other Watchtower publications, door-to-door ministry is portrayed as both a sacred duty and a privilege, and individual members are called upon to contribute to a collective effort. This collective dimension of missionary activity is not merely a rhetorical advice. It constitutes a social reality grounded in communicative and ritual practices. The study of magazines and publications during the bi-weekly meetings follows a predetermined and fixed liturgy. First, a member of the congregation reads aloud a paragraph from the Watchtower or another publication from the stage. Another member then asks those in attendance to respond to one or two questions related to the passage. These questions are not random, they are printed at the bottom of each page, leaving little room for local adjustments. And then when a participant raises their hand to answer, their name is called from the stage and they are given a microphone so that everyone can hear the response. The person leading the meeting typically offers brief appreciative comments, and after a few answers have been collected in this way, the congregation moves on to the next paragraph. Although the participants' answers may appear spontaneous, an attentive observer will soon notice that most answers are more or less elaborate paraphrases of the passages just read from the stage. This is also not accidental. So having been informed of the meeting program in advance, congregants are encouraged to study the relative texts, reflect on the printed questions, take note, prepare, and in many cases even rehearse their answer and be ready to offer them during the congregation meeting. Those of you who are familiar with speech act theory and Roy Rappaport theory of ritual will recognize here a mechanism for the constitution of commitment. The performance of a speech act commits the speakers to upholding its content and binds the speaker to its truth. Yet, an important clue that we are not dealing here with individual but with collective commitments emerges from the particular use of personal pronouns during these exchanges. Although Jehovah's Witnesses may share personal feelings and experiences with the congregation, neither the first person pronoun I nor the second personal pronoun you is predominant in structuring the interaction. Empirical observation suggests that a significant portion of the congregants' answers instead employs the we form. This, again, is no coincidence. The first person plural pronoun frequently recurs in Watchtower publications, including in the formulation of study question. In turn, the phrasing of the questions influences the expected form of the answer. Consider this example from an article titled Who Would Be Interested in This? The paragraph reads, "Our magazines discuss the real meaning behind current events and direct attention to the Bible and God's kingdom. They are the only magazines on earth that are publishing salvation. Therefore, we want to give them wide distribution." And at the bottom of the page, you can see the question, the related question, why do we want to give the magazines wide distribution? While multiple answers are technically possible, the structure and content of the text already suggests a typical answer that should be in the form, we want to distribute them because they are publishing salvation. Such a statement entails the speaker recognition of a group goal, marked by the pronoun we, and a commitment to the truth of the statement, so that there is a shared will to distribute the magazines. Moreover, by including themselves in the we group and restating the paragraph's message, the speaker implicitly reaffirms their own alignment with the collective goal and their intention to do their share in its realization. Thus, the question and answer structure of the ritual closely aligns with Tuomela's bulletin board view. These kinds of interactions, repeated dozens of times each week, twice a week throughout the entire year, are bound to shape the motivational structure of the participants. They provide desire-independent reasons for action oriented toward the realization of shared goals. Moreover, they offer a rationale for helping others fulfill their part in the collective effort. As one of my interlocutors puts it, alone, what would lose courage? But it's not because in that moment you think, this sucks, that you back off. That's also the reason why we arrange to meet for service with one another. So from this perspective, the Jehovah's Witnesses' typical practices of preaching in pairs no longer appears merely as a form of reciprocal control, but rather as the enactment of the basic unit of collective action. Now, the ritual interaction during the biweekly meetings can also be read through the lens of Gilbert's poetry reading examples. And as such, it provides the ground for the construction of collective beliefs. A telling illustration comes from the Jehovah's Witnesses' attitude toward technology and media. So allow me to sketch this second example fairly quickly. Many of the individuals I interviewed emphasized highly discerning media practices. In particular, they expressed strong aversion for the widespread presence of pornographic, occult, and violent content across various media platforms, and consistently stressed their active avoidance of such materials. As one interlocutor put it, "I'm not some kind of delicate flower, but I don't need to watch those things. And my wife doesn't either. We'd rather discuss something together or study something, for instance in the Watchtower." These attitudes clearly reflect the content of many articles discussed during Jehovah's Witnesses' bi-weekly meetings, which repeatedly warn about the dangers of harmful media content. Such articles are examined within this same question and answer framework described earlier. After reading paragraph after paragraph on the dangers of immoral entertainment, the congregation is invited to respond to questions such as, what form of entertainment do we reject and why? Or why can we show hatred toward lowliness when it comes to our choice of music? It is therefore reasonable to assume that the ritual setting is designed, at least in part, to instill certain attitudes toward media among the members of the congregation. Still, understood analogically to Gilbert's poetry reading example, the expression of such evaluations allow for possible discrepancies between collective beliefs and individual attitudes. In private conversations, some Jehovah's Witnesses admit watching shows like Breaking Bad or House of Cards. However, these admissions were immediately followed by expressions of concern about how their congregation would react if such preference became known. A witness told me, for example, Breaking Bad is probably somewhat at the limit. Yeah, but, well, I wouldn't go and tell my congregation, hey, I'm watching Breaking Bad. I mean, you have some idea of who might also watch it, and you know with whom you can talk about such things. So my interlocutor is clearly expressing a private attitude, and they're fully aware that fellow witnesses would have a standing to rebuke them in the name of the group's collective position. This, of course, does not imply that there is always a gap between individual and collective attitudes. It does suggest, however, that it is not necessary for all members of a group or even for the majority of them, to privately endorse a particular belief in order for that belief to be attributed to the group. What matters is that the group is collectively committed to it. So, in summary, my argument runs as follows. The ritual practice of the Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly their question and answer discussion, provide a mechanism that constitutes them as a collective actor capable of pursuing collective goals and upholding collective beliefs, as well as other forms of collective intentionality that I cannot address here. This collective actor does not possess a distinct metaphysical existence, and yet its intention cannot be reduced to the sum of its members' individual intentions. Rather, they must be understood as conceptually irreducible collective intentions. So I hope that my discussion has provided you with at least a sense of how this is possible and what it entails. Now I would like to move slowly but deliberately toward a conclusion, and to do so I want to pose 3 critical questions to my framework in order to dispel some possible misunderstandings. And these questions are inspired by reactions that my book has received. The first and perhaps the most difficult question is simply, is it so? So that is, can you demonstrate that this theoretical framework truly explains the empirical findings? And I would say that the answer to this question depends on how we define explanation and what expectation we bring to the idea of demonstration. So from a realist point of view, it's clear that any social event has multiple determinants, and that taken by one, events will require distinct causal constellation to account for their existence. However, I would maintain that social scientific research can and should seek to identify general mechanisms that are generally valid and operational within a given context. I argue that collective intentionality can be understood as such a mechanism. In this sense, my approach can be seen as a form of abductive reasoning, a reasoning to the best explanation. In light of the available data and in comparison with other possible approaches, I suggest that collective intentionality offers the most compelling explanatory framework. Another critical question is the following. So, someone might ask, your framework seems equally applicable to religious groups such as the Jehovah's Witnesses as to sport teams, political parties, or people planning a mountaintop picnic. Does this mean that religion has no specificity and that we should drop the use of the concept altogether? The answer is yes and no, but mostly no. The framework I'm proposing emphasizes that when it comes to the ontology of religious collectivities, there is no need to invoke conceptual resources beyond those required to understand any other strongly conceived human collective. From an ontological perspective, a religious group and a political group are indistinguishable insofar as both can be understood as the product of collective intentions. In this sense, yes, my framework underscores that religious collectivities are a garden variety social fact like many other. At the same time, however, I believe that religion remains a useful concept. That is, scholars of religion can have good reason to use the term religion to demarcate a certain type of social fact, a particular kind of social relation in the world. For instance, one might identify as religious those forms of society that are predicated on the assumption of possible communication with postulated superhuman entities. This is a tricky, but in my view, very crucial point. The term religion does not designate a natural kind in the world. There is no essential thing that is predestined to be called religion. Rather, it is scholars of religion who decide which phenomena they wish to categorize as religious based on the usefulness of that determination for theoretical or analytical purposes. However, if such a determination takes place against the backdrop of the framework that I'm proposing here, it will refer to real entities in the world, entities with real causal powers. In the book, I refrain from making any such determination, and in that sense, the book does not offer a theory of religion. I simply note that rituals provide effective mechanisms for the creation of collective intentions, and that there is therefore a connection between rituality, conceived in a particular way, and the production of social facts. Now, allow me to pose one final question, one that serves both as a bridge to further reflection and as a way to drawing my talk to a close. The question is the following. You seem quite wary of the idea of a group mind, yet relatively uncritical about the capacity of individuals to constitute collective intentions. Is your project in the end a defense of methodological individualism? The term methodological individualism can mean different things, so my immediate answer would be no, but with qualifications. So hopefully in my discussion so far, I was able to make clear my rejection of individualism in the sense promoted by rational choice theory, as well as so-called singularist approaches that seek to reduce robust concepts of we to interlocking intentions framed in the I form. At the same time, it's true that I assume collective intentions are grounded in individual minds and emerge from the ways in which people view themselves in relation to one another. In that sense, my approach does not reject the role of individual cognition, but it understands it as relational and situated, and not isolated and self-sufficient. Indeed, the notion of emergence is one that increasingly interests me, particularly as developed in the work of the British sociologist Dave Elder-Vass. His relational theory of norm circles and social entities offers promising tools for thinking about the ontological status of collective actors. Using an emergentist framework, we could say that human collectives are entities with emergent properties, that these properties arise from the organization of their individual members, but are not possessed by any of the members in isolation. Collective intentionality in this way function as the organizational principle that gives rise to the emergent properties. To say that the emergence of a particular group properties depend on the organization of the group's members is to adopt a non-eliminative reductionism. This means that while emergent properties can be explained by the configuration of the individual actors, they cannot be explained away. In my own work, I have proposed that we can identify collective intentionality in the wild by observing its generative mechanism and its causal consequences. This too is compatible with an emergentist account. The generative mechanism, for instance, Tuomela's bulletin board view, corresponds to the so-called morphogenesis of the emergent properties of a human collective. That the intentions of a group are ultimately enacted by individuals, whether it is a Jehovah's Witness handing out a leaflet or rebuking a fellow member in the name of the group, this can also be described in emergentist terms as a form of infrastructuration, the expression of group properties at the level of individual agents. Without membership in the group, these individuals would not have access to the powers they exercise. These powers then can be understood as group powers, real causal capacities implemented through individual members. Building on this framework, Elder-Vass has introduced the concept of normative circles to describe the real social structures that emerge through collective intentionality and that exert real causal powers, both enabling and constraining on their members. A religious group can be understood as one of such normative circle. Importantly, however, it is the normative circle that defines the extent of the group, and not the group, however defined in social or institutional terms, that determines the boundaries of the norm circle. Following Georg Simmel, Elder Voss suggests that individuals are always members of multiple, overlapping, and potentially competing normative circles. As a result, individuals may be subject to distinct and at times conflicting normative expectations from different circles they are simultaneously belonging. In recent months, I have begun tentatively to apply this framework to two new case studies. First, the study of risk awareness during the COVID-19 pandemic, and second, the dynamics of affiliation, disaffiliation, and reaffiliation among Jehovah's Witnesses. These projects will have to be the subject of a future talk, but I would be glad to sketch them briefly in the Q&A if you so wish. Thank you very much for your attention.